I love to write about fictional characters. That's my favorite part of writing. But it takes me a very long time to sort of give birth to them. And here was my mother, perhaps the most colorful character I've ever written about, who was right there to be written about.
The novelist Brian Morton is here to talk about his first work of nonfiction, Tasha, a son's memoir.
The sound was very important to me, and I really let the sound guide me.
Rachel Careau joins us to discuss her new translation of two novels by Colette, Cherie and The End of Cherie. Plus, my colleagues Lauren Christensen and Joumana Khatib will be here to talk about what they've been reading. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's May 20th. I'm John Williams. Brian Morton is here. He is the author of 5 novels, including Florence Gordon and Starting Out in the Evening. But he joins us to talk about his first nonfiction book, Tasha, a son's memoir. Brian, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so that was a partial lie. We will primarily discuss your memoir, but I want to start with your first novel, The Dylanist, which was published in 1991 because it plays an important role in setting up this new book. Tell me about how your real mother and father might show up in that work of fiction and how it in some ways inspired your memoir.
I started The Dylanist shortly after my father died, and the parents in the book are very much my parents, or one version of my parents. The premise of the book was that I was writing about an imaginary younger sister of mine, the child of American communists, someone who'd inherited their parents' dissatisfaction with the world, but not their faith that the world could be changed. Somebody in the course of the book jokes that she's a Dylanist rather than Marxist or a Trotskyist. As I say, I started the book shortly after my father died, and the portrait of him, I think, was bathed in the glow of idealization that one feels for a parent after they die. And I'm afraid that the portrait of my mother in the book was a more satirical one, partly because she was the one who was still around, partly because it's easier to satirize your intrusive Jewish mother than your brooding Irish father. That seems to me one of the laws of storytelling. And when my mother first read the book, I gave her a copy shortly before it came out. She left a message on my answering machine that began, "Hi, Brian. This is your former mother."
Was that your first sign of uh-oh, or did you assume that she was going to not like the book?
Well, I gave it to her before the book had been set in print, so I could make a few changes if there were things she absolutely couldn't stand. So I anticipated that there were elements of it that wouldn't delight her. Over the years, she became more comfortable, I'd say, with the portrait of her in the book, taking it as I intended it, as a sort of loving satirical portrait of her. But even so, and now I'm getting to the new book, Tasha, even so, after she died in 2016, I found myself thinking more about that portrait of her in the early novel and wanting to return to her, wanting to write about her in a way that would convey more of the fullness of her.
And you're an accomplished novelist. What was it that kept you from writing another novel where there's a very richly imagined, fuller character based on your mother?
I'm not so sure about that. Part of what was going on was that after my novel Florence Gordon came out in 2014, I'd spent 4 or 5 years working on a novel that just didn't come off for various reasons. And when the pandemic started, I'd kind of put that novel aside and was looking for something new to write. And I started thinking once again about writing about my mother. And I started writing a few pages about her. And I find that I relish the freedom to write directly, to write without having to invent any characters. I love to write about fictional characters. That's my favorite part of writing. But it takes me a very long time to sort of give birth to them. And here was my mother, perhaps the most colorful character I've ever written about, who was right there to be written about. So I think that had something to do with it.
That's interesting. So before we get more into the details of her life and personality, I'm just curious because it was interesting to hear you say that you felt this freedom, because I was going to ask if it felt scary or freeing to be writing about real people rather than fictional ones for the first time. And I feel like some novelists might say that it's freeing to be in the imagined world and not have
Right,
to worry
right.
about, whether or not you're matching the actual person. What was the freedom? Why did you feel that, do you think?
The freedom was that there were so many scenes, so many vivid scenes that were already there in my imagination that I didn't have to dream up. My mother was a rather dramatic character. So it was as if the drama and the story were already there in front of me.
Let's set up a little bit who she was. She left home when she was 16. Where did she grow up? Why did she leave home? And what was her life like immediately after that, if you know?
She grew up in the Bronx. She had a rather difficult childhood situation. Her father had been an actor in the Yiddish theater in the 1930s. And when the Yiddish theater died out, he became a sort of traveling director. This was a time when Jewish American culture was so vibrant that there were Jewish centers all over the country that could sustain their own acting troupes. So he would leave the family for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and be joined in these other places by a lifelong mistress. And at some point, my grandmother, my mother's mother, would pick up the kids and go out and join him. And the mistress would leave. The mistress would go back to New York. But anyway, my mother's, you could say her childhood experience was that of being serially abandoned. And she felt her father was always leaving her and her mother wasn't treating her that well. So at the age of 16, she left home.
And when and how did she meet your father? Did they marry relatively young?
She met my father while they were both working for a labor union, the United Office and Professional Workers Union, which is not around anymore. Upon leaving home, she'd gotten a job, as she proudly liked to relate, the first copy girl at the Daily Worker, the American Communist Party's daily newspaper. She and my father met, I think she said, on the picket line, and moved to New Jersey eventually, had my sister and me.
And much of the book, while it briefly tells your mother's history, but a lot of the book is set in the more or less contemporary time when you're dealing with your mother's decline and some of her personality traits, which, her stubbornness, her humor, are now being used almost tactically against you because you're trying to help her in this new phase of her life. So the book becomes both a portrait of her and also a portrait of what it means to care for or try to care for an older parent. What were some of those frustrations, and how much of that played a role in why you wanted to write the book as a kind of relaying of this experience to other people?
That experience was searing in many ways. When she became less and less able to take care of herself, but unwilling to give up an inch of her independence, it was difficult for my sister and my wife and I to thread the needle between respecting her wish to be independent and assuring her safety. So that at one point I had to take her driver's license away because she really couldn't drive safely anymore and was a danger to herself and others. It was terrible. She was bitterly angry about it and refused to take a cab, insisting that she was a depression baby and she never paid for a cab and never would. I had had no hesitations, no second thoughts about taking her license away, but she was living by herself at the time. At an instant, somebody who had been independent and social and proud of being able to go around on her own suddenly became confined to her house. And that kind of social isolation was terribly damaging to her. I feel that with elderly parents, all of us with elderly parents, are forced into these situations in which there's no good decision.
And you write about, at one point, this is not a prolonged screed of any kind, neither the book as a whole or even this little part of it, but you do write in a fairly potent paragraph or two about the American ethos of being on your own, and how the flip side of that and the flip side of the sort of rugged independence is that it can feel like we fall through the cracks of caretaking, and how much of that frustration existed in terms of feeling like there should be better options for people as they age.
When we reached a point where we needed to find resources to take care of my mother, I was simply astonished at how few resources there are. I don't know of any government database that can help. We were given the names of many private consultants, elder care consultants, who it turned out pretty much to a person were passing off their own scant resources and scant contacts as some kind of expertise. As I say in the book, we eventually, because she was adamant about not leaving her home, found some caregivers, some private caregivers who came very highly recommended. My mother would complain about them. At first, I didn't take her that seriously. I thought she'd complain about anyone who was taking care of her in her home. But then I got curious or suspicious and did something that I'm not quite sure is completely legal, but I concealed a recording device in her home. And I found that her aides were verbally abusing her in horrible ways.
It's a very harrowing scene in the book.
When I was writing that scene, I still had the recordings, but I could not go back and listen to them. It was just too painful. And so I recreated them from memory. Later, I did bring myself to listen to them and realized that I had remembered them pretty much word for word. But as I say in the book, that the state of elder care in our country is so dire that when you discover that your parents' private aide has been verbally abusing them, the thought crosses your mind, at least she wasn't being physically abused.
Your mother was, despite the many dark strains in the book that have to do with both that and just the nature of getting older and caring for parents and the difficulties of all of that, your mother was clearly very funny. That comes across both in reminiscences and then even when she's older and being stubborn. At one point you said that you hired landscapers for her twice and that she's threatened to sue them both times. So, you get the sense of someone who, obviously in your position, that would be infuriating, but to read about it is, like you said earlier, there is something very comical about the degree of her stubbornness and independence.
Thank you. And I'll just say it was often joyous for me too, at the same time as it was frustrating. I tell an anecdote in the book of when she was in a rehab center, a nurse coming in to take her blood pressure, and my mother saw that the nurse was wearing a cross around her neck. And my mother promptly starts arguing with her about religion. How can you, a person of science, believe in God? If God is all powerful, what do we need you for? And
Tasha, this is doing nothing for your blood pressure. Let's just take the blood pressure.
And when she was hassling the nurse in this way, I had to turn away because I didn't want either of them to see me laughing.
I want to talk about her last words. You recount them, and then that leads to, I think, the most remarkable stretch of the book, which will leave people to read for themselves because you can't really recount it on a podcast. But this stretch of the book where you sort of inhabit her perspective for a while. But what were her last words? And at one point you say that you almost were glad that these were her last words.
My mother was in something like a coma for the last week of her life, and she revived briefly when an aide came in to change her. At this point, she was in a dementia unit. And when she revived, she started cursing at the aide. That's just something she liked to do. Ever since I was a little kid, she swore it could make sailors blush. Anyway, my sister and I were heartened to hear her saying words, thinking that she'd come back to the surface. And so after the aide left, my sister said, "I love you, Mom." And my mother said, "Bullshit, go to hell." And I said, "I love you." And she said, "Well, I hate you." And she lived for several more days. And those were the last words that anyone heard her speak. Thinking about it later, my first impulse was to think that she still thought she was talking to the person who was roughly changing her diaper. But then, as I wrote about it, when I was working on the book, I took a kind of comfort from the idea that perhaps she did know exactly who she was speaking to. Perhaps she was saying something genuine about her anger about all the ways in which she wished we had taken better care of her. And
Hmm.
as I wrote about it in the book, I began the chapter in my voice, thinking about her and thinking about what those last words might have meant to her. And then gradually I found myself switching over into writing in her voice about all the slights, all the disappointments that she felt she had suffered in the course of her life. And yeah, it's about a 5-page monologue, I think. I'll never know whether I was channeling her accurately.
Well, by the time it appears in the book, it stands out as different than the rest of the book, and it certainly feels earned. Even if obviously you're right, you'll never know if you were totally accurate, but it has the ring at least of emotional truth, as does much of the rest of the book. The book again is Tasha, a Son's Memoir by Brian Morton. Brian, thanks again for being here to talk about it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Rachel Careau is here. She has just published her translation of Chérie and the End of Chérie, 2 novels by the French writer Colette. Rachel, thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I think people in the States obviously know the name Colette, but you make a case in the introduction that her reputation overseas is slightly different than it is here. How would you explain that?
I don't know really why it is that she's better known in France than she is here. Lydia Davis, in her introduction, makes a good point, which is that we may know her here for Gigi primarily, which was made into a film starring Audrey Hepburn, and perhaps that's tainted her reputation here. Whereas in France, she is read more. She was known after the death of Proust as the greatest living French prose stylist. She's appreciated there more for her actual writing and probably read more.
She communicated with Proust and they were friendly and she was very prolific. Where do these 2 books that are combined here in one volume, where did they fit in her career? When did they come and how are they considered in terms of where they fit in terms of the rest of her work?
Chérie was written in 1920, published in 1920. The End of Chérie was published in 1926. So they're kind of in the middle of her career. She wrote the early Claudine novels, which were published not under her own name, but under the name of her first husband, Henri Gauthier Villard, better known as Willie. And she had published The Vagabond before these books. And then she wrote right up until the end of her life. So I would say they're kind of midway through her career.
And because we talked about her reputation and the fullness of her bibliography being better known in France, are these considered remarkable for any particular reason, or are they considered among her best works there?
I think they are considered among her best. They are remarkable for their style. They have a tremendously economical style. They're very lean, taut novels. And Julia Kristeva called her the priestess of the mot juste. And it's really true. She pared these novels down to the bare minimum, both in terms of language and in terms of the details that she gives you. So she paints a very complex picture with very few words. She does a lot with a little, which is very hard to do.
And let's give people just a brief summary of what they're about. There are obviously 2 of them. They're both, I think they're each about 150 pages long. And how do they relate to each other? And what's the story that we're being told?
Both concern a love affair between Leah, an aging courtesan at the end of a long, successful, lucrative career, and her very young lover, Chérie. And in the first novel, we see them just before Chérie is about to enter an arranged marriage. They part, he marries, he grows disillusioned with his young wife. He leaves her, he goes back to Leah. He can't accept the signs of her aging, and he leaves her definitively at the end of the first novel.
What is the age gap between them, roughly?
Leah is 49 at the start of Chérie, the novel, and Chérie is 25, so a much younger man. And when we pick up their story in the second novel, we're on the other side of the First World War. Chéri has served and been decorated, and he's come back from the front to a changed world. We're no longer in the Belle Époque. Everyone around him has changed and adapted to this new post-war reality, except for Chéri, and he's unable to adapt, and it's his downfall.
Now to the idea of translating this book. It's presumably been translated before. What drew you to it, and what really inspired you to issue your version of it?
Yes, it's been translated before. There are 2 available translations of Chéri, and really only one of The End of Chéri. The first book, Chéri, was translated by Roger Senhouse, and that translation came out in 1951, I believe. It was later translated by Stanley Applebaum and published around 2001. Roger Senhouse also translated The End of Chéri.
You write that one biographer called Colette appallingly difficult to translate. So why, why do you think the biographer said that? And did you find that to be the case either at the beginning or throughout the process?
Well, I did find it to be the case, and I can understand why the biographer said that. It's not that she uses difficult syntax, which you would think would be difficult to translate, and it is, but rather her syntax is not the problem. It's the economy, the leanness of her writing.
I actually find that so interesting when you wrote about the spareness and the leanness, because on the one hand, as someone who doesn't translate, you think, oh, okay, it's closer to the bone, and so there aren't maybe as many choices to make. But I guess on the other hand, it doesn't leave you as many options. Is that part of the problem of a very spare style when you're translating it, that you sort of have to drill down to the one exact thing they're saying?
I think that's part of it. One of the problems with her spare style is that the sentences can lack some of the words that usually oil a sentence, the words that make a sentence flow. So they can sound a little bit bare, sometimes a little syncopated. And the sound was very important to me. And I really let the sound guide me. But it's difficult to make that bone on bone style kind of flow.
Hmm. I'm so curious about the technical aspects of doing this. Like, for instance, Senhouse's translation. Do you read that in one gulp and then dive into your own? Do you refer back to other translations as you go? What's the actual text to text process like?
Well, I started out by reading the Senhouse and the Applebaum, but I concentrated on the Senhouse. I did not read the French before I translated it, and then I just dove in. I did refer back to the Senhouse as I was working to see what choices he had made, but I tried to make a very close translation of the French. And what happened when I started making my own translation was I discovered that Senhouse had really diverged from the original text. He had embellished a lot. He had really padded the text. He added a lot of adjectives and conjunctions like and relative pronouns like who and which. He would change sentence structure. He would break one sentence into 3 or combine 3 sentences into one. He changed the paragraphing. He would change words so that, for example, a simple word like esclave, slave, would become Circassian, so like a very dramatic, florid word. He also made a lot of mistranslations, and I had the great benefit of having access to an online dictionary, an online French dictionary, kind of like the OED. It's a 17-volume exhaustive dictionary called the Trésor de la langue française informatisée. And that dictionary includes slang and argot, specialized and technical terms, classical and rare usages. And it helped me track down Colette's rare words. She was a consummate stylist who succeeds in doing a lot with very little, which is so difficult to do. And she achieved this remarkable economy of expression that nevertheless carries a lot of complexity. I really do admire her as a writer. And that's one of the things I love about these novels is just they're so beautifully written. I find them very fresh and accessible and modern. They're not 19th century novels, so they're very approachable.
Absolutely. Well, you've certainly brought that through in the English. It is an elegant novel or two novels, entertaining, touching, and complex, but yes, in a very taut style, a very interesting style. Rachel Careau, the translator of Colette's Cherie and the End of Cherie, recently published. Thanks for being here to talk about them.
Thanks so much. I've enjoyed it.
My colleagues Lauren Christensen and Joumana Khatib join me now to talk about what we've been reading. Hello, you two.
Hey, John.
Hey, everybody.
Lauren, let's start with you.
Sure. So I'm reading Four Treasures of the Sky by an author named Jenny Tinghui Zhang. Before I describe the book, I want to clarify that this is not the same Jenny Zhang as the woman who wrote Sour Heart, another book, another author I really love, but this is a completely separate author. The mistake has been made a couple of times on the desk, so I want to clarify. So this book is a historical novel, and it starts off with a kidnapping in a coastal province in China in the late 19th century. And this young preteen girl is kidnapped from this fish market that she lives near. And it sets off this really sort of harrowing journey to the American West. So she ends up in a sex trafficking ring, and she's, shipped over in a literal bucket of coal. Her body is covered in coal, and she's cramped in this box. And somehow when she gets to San Francisco, it's worse than being on that boat. And, I won't give away the whole plot, but through her survival and maneuvering and meandering and doing really whatever she can to survive, it's this just incredible blend of plot and interiority. It's a great balance is what I'm saying. You've kind of got the Dickensian adventure and tragedy, but you also have really deep psychological portrait of this woman. And it's funny, I keep comparing it in my head to, obviously there's, the backdrop and the setting are so different, but in terms of reader investment in this young woman's coming of age, it made me think so much of Cora in Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad from a few years ago. A strange comparison, but if you love that book, I just have a feeling you might like this one too.
It's a debut novel?
It's a debut, yeah, and it's it's this really sweeping story. Of course, because of the time frame, she's in Idaho at this point when the Chinese Exclusion Act goes into effect. So, she's really anchored in this time and place, but at the same time, as I'm comparing it to Colson Whitehead, there are such universal themes in the book, and I was just pulled along all the way through and really admired it.
So you get a sense of her interiority, like you said, and all this adventure. And then you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act. So is there a broader social commentary that the novel is making?
Definitely. It's hard to read this book without thinking now about violence against Asian Americans in this country. And so, I don't know when the author started writing this, but it's very obvious how deep that history runs and how embedded it is, obviously, in like our legal system. So I think you can read it with or without political messages, and it's still just this really beautiful humanistic story.
Sounds like the start of a really promising career. Joumana, what are you reading these days?
Well, okay, so I might be the last person in my radius who has not read The Last Samurai, but that's what I'm doing now. This is my bedtime reading. It's by Helen DeWitt. It's one of the books that I've been meaning to read for probably 5 or 6 years. And I really love Helen DeWitt's writing. I came to her sort of sideways because the first thing I read by her was actually a short story collection called Some Trick. So now I'm reading The Last Samurai, which is a book that she first wrote, I think, in 2000. And it was pretty well received, but it fell out of print and then was resurrected recently. And then I think found this sort of second life. So it's about a single mother and her prodigiously gifted son. I mean, he's reading Homer by the time he's a small child. And it's a very intellectual book, but also very emotional, right? I mean, the boy wants to learn about his father who's absent. So his mother shows him Kurosawa. It really takes you in places that you don't totally expect. And for me, it's been great bedtime reading because I feel like, again, I'm becoming a child again, listening to bedtime stories I used to hear, although mine did not involve Greek and Japanese.
Do you consider me in your radius?
Well, I don't. You know what? Yes, I'm feeling
Okay, well,
expanded.
I
Yes.
haven't read it.
Okay.
It's been on my pile for a long time too. But you mentioned Japanese and Greek. Are there mathematical elements to this book? Is the child like a math prodigy of some type?
Yes, he really is an equal opportunity prodigy, which is amazing. And it does it in a way, or he comes off in a way where you don't want to give him a swirly. It like she's. Oh my God, am I allowed to say that? Am I gonna?
I have to look it up, so I'm not. I'll tell you later.
Okay. Okay.
And he doesn't come across as the sort of wonder child of movies where he's too precocious for anyone's good.
Yeah, and he's not like a kid who's a brain in a jar. And I think that's something that so far, I'm not even halfway through it, but thus far, she does a really good job of balancing the emotional and the intellectual aspects of this story, because reading about geniuses is actually not all that interesting. I mean, because they kind of do the same thing, which is be really good at what they do and then tend to be terrible at everything they can't do.
Right.
You know, that kind of runs the gamut after a while. But she's managed to make this a really satisfying mother-son story. I'll read anything with a single mother in it. So this is hitting a lot of notes for me.
That's great.
Yeah. How about you, John?
I am rereading a novel by the Icelandic writer Halldór Laxness, who won the Nobel Prize in, I think, 1955. I read it 5 years ago or so as preparation of sorts when I went to Iceland on a vacation. And I'm rereading it now for work-related reasons, but he's a fantastic writer. There's another book of his that I may talk about in the future when I reread that one. But Independent People he was pretty prolific, but this is, I think, widely considered his masterpiece. It's about a sheep farmer named Barter, Bjartur, in the early 20th century, who tends his sheep farm in remote Iceland and, as the title would suggest, is fiercely proud of his independence. And this is both somewhat tragic. It can be very funny. Funny is not a word I've heard a lot used to describe this book, but I find, and it's obviously a nuanced, subtle humor, but I actually find it very funny at times. It is also harrowing because of the lifestyle that the characters live. There are a couple of incredibly intense and beautifully contained set pieces and chapters, one of which involves someone at home alone with an animal that they think they become convinced that this animal is sort of possessed, and in the middle of the night they're alone and they can hear the animal down in the barn, and it builds to this amazing climax. And then there's another chapter where Barter is out in a terrible snowstorm and has to survive for multiple days, out in this driving snow and freezing temperatures. And so it has these very nature specific descriptions, and Iceland is obviously a beautiful and interesting place. But it's also just an epic story, and eventually Barter's daughter grows up and becomes just as independent as he is. But in her case, that means, not wanting to be on her own in remote Iceland. And she has her own ideas about what her life should look like. And some of the book's drama then comes from that relationship. Overall, I do think that it took me both the first time and this time. I do think it takes a little bit to get into the book because it starts with a wide lens voice that covers a lot of Icelandic history in the sense of the myths there and sets the tone, but you don't really meet the characters in it. I think it gives the impression that this is going to be a 500-page book that is fairly difficult to read, but it becomes something very pleasurable to read. And these scenes of, Barter's obsessed with his sheep and with sheep in general. And he hates, for instance, someone essentially gives him a cow they think they're doing him a favor. And he's incensed that they've done this because to him, the cow is just going to use the resources that the sheep should have. And he really hates this cow. The rest of the family comes to love it. That becomes a source of conflict. There is a larger political question, which is interesting to read as an American, because Barter's sense of independence and what it means to not depend on others really echoes the idea of American freedom and independence, and the idea that you don't want handouts and you don't want to give anybody else a handout. And you get this sense from him very clearly, and you also see the limits of that and how it can become ridiculous and self-defeating. And there are efforts to collectivize the farmers to protect them economically, and he hates that idea and doesn't want to be part of any group. And so the book just covers a tremendous amount of territory, and I'm about halfway through it on this reread, and we'll have more to say about Laxness in general soonish. But I would recommend him heartily to not just this book, but his others as well. To anyone
It's
who's
translated,
interested.
right?
It is translated. Thanks for saying that. It's translated from the Icelandic by J.A. Thompson, and beautifully so. I mean, the writing is fantastic throughout. There are Cormac McCarthy-ish echoes sometimes of the nature descriptions, but again, it's far less, in my opinion, self-serious than some of McCarthy's stuff, who I also greatly admire him. But I think there's a lot here for people to chew on.
I would like to chew on possessed animals. Honestly, that's
this book is good cud.
Oh God! Oh God!
Well, John, I tend to love your dark humor, so I definitely want to pick this one up.
All right, let's run down what we read again.
I'm reading Four Treasures of the Sky by Jenny Tinghui Zhang.
I am reading The Last Samurai by Helen DeWitt.
And I'm reading Independent People by Haldor Laxness. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.